We don't do that.
3, 2, 1. All right, show's ready to start.
Yeah. How you doing, Terry? You caught back up from the weekend? I know you were asking me how I was doing after it. Do you feel like you've regained any sense of what day and time it is just yet?
No, I didn't drive as far as you. Like, at least I didn't have to get home at 2 in the morning and get up and preach the next morning.
Yeah, I think we made choices, and those choices had consequences. This was a very
Did you?
quiet house Sunday afternoon.
In that little break between worship and Bible study, did you regret your life decisions for a little bit?
I never sat down any more than I had to.
Yeah.
I just
I'm not even teaching class on Sunday morning. So for the one time, I'm sitting next to my wife, and our weekend was so crazy with, Jillian's Friday night had stuff, this prom junk, and don't get me started on that. And then we had all state choir and FC choir and improv, which went overtime. We got kicked out of the building. People stayed at the house. Baptism thrown in there, which was awesome. And all those kind of things. My wife is falling asleep on Sunday morning during class. I'm elbowing her the whole time, trying to keep her awake.
Yeah. Hey, good morning, Paul. And it's good to see Charlene back. She used to be part of our live streams during, our studies through First, Second Corinthians, and James quite a bit.
Yep.
And, good to see her. Hey, our focus today is as simple as we can make it, because that's a bad pun. No, really, this is something really important, I think, that all of us do, but we don't necessarily process through in a specific manner. Hey, Jeff, good to see you this morning. And that is trying to figure out how to take whatever it is we've gathered together as research or resources, and then not only condense it down, because I might read or study 10 to 15 to 20 hours for a particular sermon sometimes, but I've set a guidepost of a 30-minute kind of sermon space. So I've got to condense all that down. So not only will I summarize ideas I've gained from others, but sometimes you're trying to take the greatly researched concepts, wording, phrases from different material, present it in a understandable and an approachable way, but not plagiarize, but not miss the big idea, and keeping all of that sorted and simple is a big challenge, no matter what you're doing. And someone might say, well, yeah, I don't read academic books, or I don't do this. You absolutely do this all the time with everything. This is a normal communication process. Even if you're taking the biblical text and just making a 3-point outline from a chapter, this is the same thing that you're doing. The more layers you put in there, the more complicated it gets. So that's kind of like the nexus of the idea. But Terry, you had a couple of other thoughts when we were pre-gaming for this, of things that you had noted earlier as well.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think my preaching, I don't think I know, and Phil's been around for this change. I think my preaching style's kind of changed for the better. And that's included more reading in preparation. And I think one of the reasons for that, I guess it's like one of those trigger warning things. I only preach one sermon a week, which then allows me more time to dive deeper than when I was doing 2 sermons a week. And that's a major reason for the increase in quality, by the way, which is, I guess, a whole nother show. But that, and I'll tell you the other reason, Phil, is oddly enough, I don't want to give you a big head, but you and your influence using Logos, because I've had Logos for years. Only recently have I actually started using Logos in a way that impacts me beyond basically turning it into a concordance. And so those two things combined, and when I open up, because I have more time to read and to put notes into these passages, and especially when it's a textual sermon, like is what I tend to do anymore, and that wasn't as common either. all those things have left me then with, here's all this information. Here's something a guy says that I really want to share that I don't even want to change because his wording, some of these guys, their wording is so good, it's so powerful, it needs to be said that way. But then that puts me into a conundrum of sorts of, okay, do I keep referencing this person? Do I reference them at all? Do I just, I'm going to cite the source in my outline, but do I just say a commentator said? Do I say that Vang or Taylor or Wright or Fee or Moo? Do I mention those guys' names? Morgan. I mean, there's a lot of guys that you may read that, and that becomes a challenge because if you're not careful, it feels like you're just regurgitating everybody's stuff, and you're constantly citing sources. So there's a lot of challenges here, and I'm not sure. Part of our discussion was I'm still trying to figure that out because some of this just quite frankly wasn't a problem for me before in the same kind of ways.
So one of the things I'm trying to create kind of like guidelines for as I do stuff, because like Terry, I've adjusted from 2 sermons a Sunday to typically 1 sermon a Sunday, although I do longer Bible class and some other teaching opportunities, is to just kind of create some guidelines that I can use to kind of figure some of this stuff out. And Paul kind of makes a point similar to this, it's understanding the audience. So if we're going to arbitrarily define our audiences in this way, and this is totally arbitrary, and it's really just right for the show purposes right now. If my audience is Facebook, like social media, if my audience is the local church Bible class or the local church sermon, those are basically the same audience. If my audience is a publication somewhere, maybe it's a periodical, a brotherhood publication, or maybe it's even more stringent and it's like a published book or even an academic publication. Each of those different spaces have well-known, defined audiences. So if I'm going to post something on social media, I know I'll have 2 things important for me. One, it will be short. It'll be brief. And it will probably only have 1 citation, if any, because usually I'm either going to like, hey, I read this, here's the source, or I read this, here's my regurgitation of the idea. I've processed it, I've taken it in, I've kind of used it through my own voice, but I want to attribute its origin point. If I move into the next space there, which is the Bible class sermon, like Paul points out, I'm going to make sure that in my outline, it's super specific. I'll use either APA or Chicago Manual Style level guidelines and actually put the whole resource at the bottom of the outline some way or another. But in the manuscript or the notes for the message, I will typically either, unless I'm going to quote verbatim, I will typically say a commentator suggested or one place I read. And then that's when I'm going to summarize. I'm going to summarize an idea with that phrase. If I'm going to quote, I will attribute the quote. And I don't do that very often in sermons and Bible classes where I have a quote that I need to attribute to an audience. And then as I go up the food chain, you're going to see an increase in detail. That matches kind of academic practices to do that, but that's kind of what the guidelines I've been using.
Yeah, it's not so much audience as much as it's context, which includes audience, right? So for me, in a Bible class, I might cite more out of hopes that I will encourage them to read some of those sources, whereas in a sermon, I wouldn't. Right. So there's some intentional there in a Bible class itself where you have interaction and you have the ability to be a little bit more, because the other thing is in a Bible class, at least if it's an adult class, I don't have 5th graders out there. So it's different, and it's just a room of adults. Can I encourage them to read right by including right in a quote? Possibly, right? And so, and that has happened. So there's different purposes. I generally avoid the Greek and the Hebrew altogether because that's not my space. But in a Bible class, there may be something I've read about a word that's particularly important that I may quote that word. I have a rule in a sermon itself. I will never mention a Greek word,
Yeah.
period. I will say things like, the original word means this, but I'm not going to try to say the word. I'm not going to, because that's not my space, right?
Yeah.
That's for a lot of reasons.
This is the other half of our topic's purpose here. We're talking about the what right now, like what the challenge is, what the context is, what our application is. And here's the why, because the what and the why of this, this question is super important. Why we do these things in this way is to make the message accessible, to make the message relatable, to make it understandable. If we muddy up the message with, like, Terry's point with language details, there are going to be those in the audience who get challenged by that extra information in ways that we didn't intend. And here's the simple illustration of it. I'm going to type a word in the chat here.
By the way, let me give you context too. One of the reasons I don't use Greek is because there's a 91-year-old sister who sits right to my right every class, who basically is an expert in Greek, and I am not.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to mention Greek and want an expert, I'll just go, Sister Eleanor, what does this word mean? Right?
Yeah.
That's what I do. But you put up this word, which is interesting because, how do you pronounce it? If we went up and down the list, most people are going to pronounce it Baal, and then if you were to bring Salt on here, he's going to pronounce it completely different.
Right. There's a Hebrew and an Aramaic pronunciation of it, and then there's a couple other nuances to it. The most common English pronunciation is Baal. The second most common, depending on where you live regionally, is Baal. And if you say
I'm going to
either
start
of those,
using ball just because I'm a sports ball guy.
right,
So we're going to call it ball.
That's the least common, by the way, of the two. But if you don't use either of those two, and you try to actually pronounce it as it probably should be pronounced, people are going to think you have no idea what you're talking about, even if you actually do, because we've become accustomed to this is what that word is. And if you don't say it right, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm not even going to suggest the Hebrew pronunciation because every time I do that, certain people in my family just make a raised eyebrow.
No, go ahead. We want to hear it.
No, we'll do it later.
We're waiting.
But that's the point behind it, because you got to know your audience to a point, realize even if you are actually a legitimate expert in a certain thing, or even if you have expertise in an area, doing that will distract from the goal of your message. Your message isn't to teach people the proper pronunciation of a Greek or a Hebrew word, or this really complicated piece of knowledge that you gleaned in your studies. That's not going to necessarily reach your goal, because your goal is to teach the biblical truth in a way that when they leave, they've understood the message, and it can enrich their faith or challenge their preconceptions or do both. And when they sit down at lunch with their family or at dinner or just quietly down to pray afterwards, they're going to be able to consider that and ponder it in a way that actually lets them grow. But if you've created all these unintentional roadblocks, yeah, it might be accurate, and you may be super specific, and you may have finally gleaned this proper approach to a thing, but your goal is more than just that. And that's why this why side of it, why is this important? That's why a lot of preachers default, and I do this a ton, to trying to create three main points to process a text. It's because it helps for retention, it helps for repetition, it helps grasp, and it makes you make sure that you're not covering too much at a certain time. There's all these reasons for it. Some guys do 5 points. Okay, fine, great. You're still doing the same thing. You're trying to keep it manageable.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I got to be honest with you. I don't worry about the points, but I know what my space allotment is for the amount of time I'm going to cover in my outline that I do. I'm going to go, and when I start getting to that number of pages, because I know me, and I know what's this what the target is, then I start having to go, okay, what's really important here? What
yeah,
what goes, what stays, and it's the same thing, just with a different metric. We all have that space, that we've got it measured out in some way to keep it where it should be. And one of the reasons I don't use Greek, besides the fact that I'm not an expert, is I kind of sometimes try to think about what I'm preaching from Terry Francis at about 14 years old. And I got to tell you, I
that's
remember guys that,
troublesome.
yeah, yeah, no, not really. I mean, I'm still there. But I remember 14, 50-year-old Terry kind of rolled his eyes every time some guy had to bring up a Greek word and talk about the Greek word, you know? And I just think that also influences me, and I literally have a couple of rigid things. One of them is not mentioning a Greek word if I can help it. I mean, there's sometimes I have, but as a general rule, I just don't go down that path.
Right. No matter where you are in your self-perception of your language skills, you're always a little bit dangerous when you're working with the original language. Like there's a little danger there that you may miss a detail. And that's why those committee translations are all super important. And you'll notice they tend to be kind of similar. Like a
Yeah,
committee-based translation doesn't vary a lot from one another because they're arguing all those details from a high level of expertise, and then they bring it down to whatever their intended reading level is for that translation. And so that's just an illustration again of the concept. We do that with ideas too. There's a lot of super complex ideas in the writings of Paul and super complex ideas in the writings of John. Even though the language underneath those two different writers is at two different levels. John's writing is super direct, short, concise. It's been suggested he was not really an academic, if you would think of it that way. Paul's writing is super complicated, a lot of nuances in his language, but they both have complicated ideas. And so we still try to pick, okay, how deep are we going to go? Like,
yeah,
we need to keep it at a level that causes everybody to rise. By the way, you can actually make it too simple. You can actually do that. I'll read through Chris's comment here in a second, and he's put some catnip on the table. I'll read it in a moment, but I think that is something that all preachers can do better, and the struggle doesn't go away just because you've got 20 years, 25 years, 30 years of experience. In fact, I might suggest that the struggle gets more complicated the more experience you have.
yeah. I think what's interesting about Chris's statement here about the Greek word, he doesn't care about the English word, but the Greek word is, depending on when I talk to my friends who are Greek experts, and I'm talking about guys who teach Greek that I have friends with, I'll talk to them. One of the things that's interesting to me about the Greek that's so dangerous in this area, Phil, and you can speak more to this, is sometimes those of us who know a little Greek make a big deal out of things that those who know a lot of Greek don't make the same big deal out of. And it's pretty interesting that we sometimes highlight that this word was used versus this word in these two texts, and it means something radically different. And if you take the time to talk to a guy who's spent his life studying that, sometimes you'll find out not that big a deal. The Greeks use those interchangeably more than you realize.
Yeah.
It's a thing that you've just got to be careful about. That I'm just illustrating why I don't get caught up in it, because sometimes I can make a big deal out of something that's not a big deal when I actually pay attention to somebody who knows. And I use this because Hal mentioned agape earlier. I mean, John 21, there's a lot of debate, and we're not going to get into that, about whether or not those terms of love actually mean what we think they mean. There's a lot of question about that. And for years, there's this big thing there. And there's a lot of guys going, it's not as big as you think, You just got to be cautious about that.
Right. And I think concordances are awesome, but they're also super buggy whip because Bible software does the thing a concordance we'd have to use a concordance by hand, like, and so they've really become outdated in the sense of accessibility to the concept. And so, but like whether you're using a concordance or Bible software, you're doing the same thing. And that can be incredibly useful. Um, you know, um, yeah, it can be totally functional. Like this same root is used in both places. But
Yeah.
the thing that's a struggle for us is that translation isn't math; it's art, and the art of translation. I'll get back to Chris's
No,
gobbledygook.
the best part is Phil Paul's comment, which is true. Like when you start into that, you do have this feeling that my whole life has been a lie. Everything I've heard about this has been a lie my entire life.
Right.
That just made me. That's what I laughed about.
Right. So, okay, that does.
That's you win the day, Paul Hammonds. Coffee
Yeah, best
toast to
comment of
you.
the day. Free virtual taco. You get a free virtual taco. That's a new gift.
Absolutely.
But no free virtual queso because it's not that high yet. It's good, but it's not great.
But that exactly proves our point about all of this, right?
Right.
That exactly proves what we're saying here. Just be careful. You can teach John 20. You can teach John 21 about what's going on there without going and making this big distinction about which word is being used.
So that nuance is there, but that's because context helps us determine meaning, and word use is derived as much as from its base kind of definition, if you will, base concept, as it is by how you use it. English does this all the time. We're totally comfortable with it. So again, this is that detail. So we would not have this long dialogue in a sermon about explaining the nuances of this word. Even now, if I was preaching through John, I wouldn't, make a big deal about it. I would think there are other things that I could do in a sermon to make this point super clear that are on the repetition of the event. Now, in a Bible class, maybe I'll go in more detail. Maybe I'll bring some of this up and show these ideas and concepts and make those the contrast, because I can expand and explore more precisely in that setting, and I can interact. I can ask a question, get a response, and clarify.
The other thing that I'm going to do in a class on John 21 versus a sermon is a sermon. I'm going to focus on the repetition being the key. Like you said, why does Jesus keep asking him? I'm going to make the point that way. In class, I might actually say that you may have heard there's this distinction in all of this. And I might then say, that's not necessarily true. I might expose them to both sides and tell them you can choose how you want to view this. That's the purpose of class, is to allow that interaction. I mean, what me and one of the elders here, he loves that wordplay. He absolutely buys into the distinction between the two. We've had this discussion many times. I know in a class, if I brought it up and said, "Now I don't know about this," he would emphatically go off on a 5-minute tangent about how it's absolutely what it is, and I'd let him do that and let him teach the class for that point, and I would take a swig of water and just wait. But you have that opportunity in the context of a class to do something completely different.
Right, and here's the goal. You think about the what and the why. The what is this challenge, and the why, you're going to allocate time to sort it out. There's a limited resource of spiritual together time, and you're saying that this is the important thing for us right now. And so you're making this distinction. Okay, I got to keep this simple because I got a goal in mind.
Yep.
And maybe today your goal is to help people wrestle with that distinction. Okay, then make that actually be the focal point of what you're doing. Justify its presence. Like, okay, this is why this is important for us. Here's the application that we're going to go through. And this is why we're going to really explore it in detail. And so now you've got a purpose, a plan, a method to kind of get you from point A to point B. And you still have to fulfill all these goals that God has given those who are in leadership concepts and spaces to be responsible for. You're concerned about their souls. You're going to bear the consequence of what you teach is going to be equal to you and to them. All that stuff will come into play. And again, go back, and figure out how do I make these attribution things. If you're not an expert in Greek and you have no formal Greek training, be cautious. It doesn't mean you can't learn Greek on your own. I'll just tell you straight up, it's gonna be a lot harder. It's a lot more difficult to do that than it is. And you say, well, I sat down and worked through a Greek grammar, and so I know Greek. I'm like, oh, great, awesome. It doesn't mean you know Greek. It means you know that grammar and you know one person's approach to the text, and they may be experts, but that doesn't mean that we become an expert through the reading of their work.
You talk about the why. I'm going to say one of the whys when I teach a Bible class, and I think we forget about, is not just to teach the text, but in the Bible class, and at least for me, I'm trying to show them how to study the text as we walk through it together. I want them to learn. One of the benefits of the teaching a Bible class can be that we walk through the study process of the text together. If you're teaching a text, we can look at different things and talk about which one of those is right. Whereas a sermon's main purpose is for me to basically give you the summation of me walking through the text myself and saying, here's the points. Here's what you need to learn from this. But in the Bible class, one of the ways we teach people how to study their Bibles is by how we teach their Bible class and show them how to study your Bibles. Yeah. And there's a distinction between those two things. And I think it's going to dictate that you do things differently. I mean, I know that, Phil, you sit down and you're going to do 3 points for a sermon outline, but there's going to be text that you're not necessarily going to do 3 points for a complete text. You don't approach it the same way. You're going to walk through the text in a different way in a Bible class that you do in a sermon. Yeah. And that's why you're trying to show them this is how you study. This is how you learn from Scripture.
All right. So and again, let's go back through this. That brings us to this. These are questions I always ask whenever I'm speaking about anything. I want to know my what. I want to know my why. And that leads me to my when. When do we do that? When do we deal with this? We've talked about how we do these in different spaces. You still need to be able to, again, develop a skill that takes practice, and that's to summarize ideas, because you're going to summarize as you go to one side of your arbitrary distinctions, or you're going to cite and quote when you go to the other. And we do this in conversation. We'll say, hey, I was reading the news yesterday. Did you see that article about Tom Brady? And they might not have seen the article you read about it, but they've seen an article about Tom Brady. And now you're talking about, Tom Brady's, endeavors to maybe return to football. And so, boom, now you've done that same thing. So we all do this. Do so with precision. Everything that we do in these areas should have some intention behind it. Terry and I use manuscripts for the most part to speak from today. At this point in our preaching, but not everyone does that. They still have intentional practices. They may have an outline that's very brief and skeletonized. They still prepare and make those same steps. I wanted to, hit one more thing. We've mentioned this the last couple of weeks. I want to continue to keep this in the forefront of people's minds. Our friend from college, Dave Sielkos, is still sorting out the consequences of fleeing his home in the Ukraine, still helping with the care of 2 other Christian families, still working on immigration processes. And I still want everyone to pray for him. It's a very challenging thing to go from 3 weeks ago hearing munitions and explosions near your home to relative peace, but know that your friends and loved ones have their family still in the middle of that mess. And so praying for him individually and friends in Russia and friends in Moldova. It's not just that one community right now. It's that whole region is on edge.
I mean, our friend Dave, literally him and his wife Marina escaped with what they could carry on their backs. That's literally what happened. And I think last I heard, yesterday they're in Budapest, but this process to get everything taken care of could take months. So they're just in need of prayers for that.
Yeah. Terry, do you have anything else that you wanted to make sure we highlight before we close out today? I thought we covered our key goals, and just want to make sure we haven't missed anything or big other ideas.
Yeah, I think we're good. We haven't said in a while, but if there's some topic you want us to cover, we'd love for you to shoot us a message and let us know that. We'd love to cover things that you want to have covered, talk about things you want us to talk about, and just appreciate all of the really, really, really good comments today. And thanks for joining in.
And if you have a guest that you would love to see on Do the Work, let us know. Even if you think there's no way we would have them on here, you would be surprised. Tom
Brady next week talking about coming out of retirement.
I think I'd have to go through too many hoops to get to his guy. Like,
what are the 6 degrees of separation from Tom Brady?
For me, I think I might be able to get there in 2. Might be able to get there in 2 degrees of separation, but the hoops to get them to agree to let me to talk to those
impressive.
2 hoops.
That's impressive.
Pretty small. You're probably just as far. If you think for a moment, like we could get there in about 2 degrees.
Probably so.
Number 68 should key your brain.
Yeah, but I don't think they played together. So
no, but they got one mutual friend who did. So like it wouldn't be that far. Maybe 3 degrees, 2-3 degrees.
I thought you were talking about that time I dated Giselle, and that's why we're only 2 degrees. I thought that was.
Yeah, I could go to high school friends maybe and get a different direction to get there. It'd be difficult. Either way, though, everybody have a great day. If we can help you in some way in your work or in the kingdom, let us know. Take care.